We have seen it over and over. People are doing terrible things and trying to blame anyone or anything that isn't them. Before you condemn such people for blaming their childhood, society, or any other convenient scapegoat for their actions, you should figure out where you stand on free will. Have we, or haven't we? Alongside other uncrackable gems like what love is, or what came first, the chicken or egg, this question is complex enough for the ages. Today, we are going to get to the bottom of the matter, more like laying it out in the fewest words possible. Discover the leading philosophical thesis on free will. The free will theory that is so Rick and Morty. The two sworn enemies of free will. What neuroscience has to say about free will. We are trying to shed the stereotype of long-winded philosophy rants. Feel free to play us off the stage if we take too long. What is free will? Free will is the ability to act at your discretion. A person with free will does whatever they want without being constrained by consequences or fate. Has such a person ever existed? Who has ever made a decision without being influenced by external influences? Perhaps the Tibetan monks? Philosophy theories on free will. 1. Libertarianism. It would have us believe that we do have free will. All our choices are purely our own. Their extremist view of free will deems it absolute. They hold everyone 100% responsible for their actions, because free will is devoid of any external influence. The defense of, "I was starving," will not reduce your sentence in a theft case before a libertarian judge. The circumstances are irrelevant because free will is absolute. They believe past events or environmental factors do not influence our choices. This seems a bit draconian, don't you think? Ask Jean Valjean. He was sentenced to 19 years for stealing a loaf of bread to feed his sister's starving child. Lao Tzu, Henry David Thoreau, Immanuel Kant, and John Locke are famous defenders of absolute free will. Kant argued that morality could not exist without free will. He considered the legacy to choose between right and wrong as we saw it, a vital part of human existence. Kant advocated for freedom of the self that existed beyond sensory impulses. In summary, he believed that our rational minds could overcome the influence of external factors and exercise free will. No excuses would have carried weight with them, including starving babies. Their absolutist view of free will would dish the maximum sentence because they considered criminals as having willingly and knowingly played the odds and lost. 2. Determinism. It claims that none of us have ever made a choice. We don't have free will. It opposes libertarianism and deems free will an illusion. Determinists believe that past events and environmental factors predetermine our actions and seal our fate. They paint us as robots, programmed by our past experiences and environmental factors. Free will does not exist. We are all out here on a giant stage, following directions to a T. Famous determinists include Aristotle, David Hume, Thomas Hobbes, and Ralph Waldo Emerson. David Hume posited that free will is an illusion. He believed that motives and desires, born of past experiences and environmental factors, dictate our actions. Hume believed that previous events predetermined our course of action, and we had little to do with the outcome. Many serial killers and sexual predators have depressing stories of tormented childhoods. No one saved them from the relentless physical or emotional abuse dished out by those who they trusted most. They eventually morphed into the monsters we all love to hate. Determinism would let such characters, and all of us, shed their moral responsibility. No one would ever be safe. If you ask us, determinism is a blueprint for anarchy, clothed as logical thought. Or is it? Could we really be trapped by our genetics and environment? Did we delude ourselves into believing we have free will? Did you decide to watch this video? Or were you meant to watch this video? Time for something a little less out there. Number 3. Compatibilism. It bridges the gap between two extremes. It reconciles libertarianism and determinism. It accepts that while environmental factors and previous events bog down our choices, we can still decide to act against our preferences or desires. Self-awareness and fortitude, developed through spiritual practices like meditation and religion, play a significant role in this. Law has come a long way since the times of Valjean. We now have the concept of diminished responsibility. Where determinists would have let him walk scot-free and libertarians would have slapped him with a full sentence, compatibilists would walk the middle path. They would consider mitigating factors like temporary insanity, mental incapacity, self-defense, or provocation to set a just sentence. Neuroscience and free will. Though it shows much promise, neuroscience has failed to settle the age-old debate on free will. Don't let the lack of a smoking gun get you down. Neuroscientists have made astonishing discoveries by studying our brain's decision-making regions, that is, the parietal cortex, prefrontal cortex, and basal ganglia. Using neural imaging techniques like MRIs, EEGs, and PETs, they are learning more daily about the complex interaction between these brain regions and networks, how they process information, and weighing the costs and benefits of every option available before making a decision. Let's dig deeper in 3 major studies of neuroscience and free will. 1. Neural mechanisms and free will. Neuroscientists believe we have no control over our actions and decisions. They seek to prove that what we call free will is the result of neural processes beyond our control. Doesn't this smell a lot like determinism in a lab coat? The scientists began by breaking free will into the concepts of volition and agency. Volition studies how we initiate the decision-making process for various actions, like voluntary action on one end of the scale and reflected efforts on the other. Volition studies the initiation of these actions and what role, if any, consciousness plays. It is the more technical side of the issue. Agency is more intangible because it involves studying the somewhat subjective processes of awareness to control, initiate, and execute volitional actions. Neuroscientists have pinpointed the agency's origin. Their neuroimaging experiments have isolated the brain regions responsible for planning and executing movements. They are yet to explain why these regions act independently of free will in the case of reflex and unconscious actions. For example, do we exercise free will when sleepwalking? 2. Free will and consciousness. What role does consciousness have to play in free will? Does the excuse, "I was out of my mind," carry any scientific weight? Dr. Libet's experiments prove our subconscious minds make decisions half a second before they send the memo to our conscious minds. In the 1980s, rock star neuroscientist Benjamin Libet conducted a series of experiments. He asked participants to choose a moment to flick their wrists while wired to neuroimaging machinery. The results were phenomenal. Libet proved that the subconscious decided about half a second before the subject consciously decided to flick their wrist. Libet's study faced harsh criticism. However, in 2008, a study by Mark Hallett and Masao Matsuhashi claimed to have replicated Dr. Libet's findings. 3. Neuroscience, free will, and addiction. We have long argued whether persons with substance abuse disorders are victims of a disease that robbed them of their sense of agency and volition, or are derelicts who shun the choice to resist the drugs or seek treatment. Numerous studies have been conducted on how addiction affects our sense of agency and volition. Everyone is eager to hear the results. Neuroscientists have observed that addiction alters our brain's structure and functioning. These changes disproportionately affect the regions involved in motivation, reward, and decision-making. Heavy drug users reprogram their dopamine system to reward them for using the substances. This, in turn, increases the craving for the drug. Most significant are the changes to the prefrontal cortex, a region that regulates impulse control and decision-making. Scientists are, however, split on what this means. Some believe that it limits an addict's free will. They do not have the same ability to think through choices and select the most preferential one as a person with an ordinary prefrontal cortex does. Other researchers insist that despite the structural and functional changes in the brain, addicts possess free will and do not bear diminished responsibility for their actions. Neuroscience has shed a little light on the volitional aspect of free will, but as shown by the nature of agency, some things cannot be subjected to a surgical blade and microscope. The question of free will remains largely philosophical and dependent on an individual's worldview. Is it any wonder that most of us believe in free will and are turned off to hear our best and brightest suggest that science claims we are not masters of anything, our brains included? The relationship between free will and moral responsibility. Kant was right. There can be no moral responsibility without free will. Moral responsibility is the cost of free will. A conscious person must be held responsible for actions, no matter the circumstances. If someone kidnaps your loved one and forces you to do terrible things to secure their safe return, can you claim lack of free will? After all, you have a choice to make. The extenuating circumstances may coerce you into a particular choice, but you are never powerless. Military personnel often get caught up in the crosshairs of free will and moral responsibility. Does taking an oath of obedience liberate you of your free will and hand it to the chain of command? The Nuremberg trials brought the matter of free will and moral responsibility front and center. After the horrors of World War II, judges were confronted by numerous Nazi officers who pled innocence due to lack of free will. They insisted they had no choice but to obey the morally repugnant orders that had become the new law. Did their oath of obedience and fear of victimization liberate them from the pesky burden of free will? Legacy jurisprudence, too complex to discuss here, found them guilty. They were complicit in unconscionable acts their superiors ordered. Oaths of obedience and fear for their lives and their families did not excuse them from moral responsibility. It remains so to date. State officers, including military officers who kill on their government's behalf, still bear individual moral responsibility for their actions, whether or not they face prosecution. The relationship between free will and socio-cultural factors. Free will, whether real or an illusion, cannot exist in isolation. We are social creatures that are born into a set of social and cultural structures we have to stay in. Yet, we are expected to go with the flow. What is the point of having free will if you are never allowed to use it? If Hitler takes over and the flow calls for genocide, you are bound to march to the drum. Free will be damned. Society and culture temper the exercise of free will, especially where it upsets the predetermined order. All social and cultural orders will always value conformity above all. In extreme settings, even small expressions of free will are considered an insult to the larger establishment and a threat to the known way of life. Dyeing your hair a wild color will make people extremely uncomfortable. Why? Deviance, even the harmless variety, cannot be tolerated. Free will can only be exercised in the manner determined. You are free to color your hair, but only in tones that occur naturally. Neon reds are for stoplights, not heads. If the entire world is beginning to sound like a fascist regime, you are not alone. Is it a wonder that most people must move to a new environment to exercise their free will? It cannot exist within a set of social and cultural norms that are not voluntarily co-opted. How free will views impact social policy. All our criminal justice systems are entrenched in libertarian views of free will. How else could they punish people if they considered them victims of circumstance, as determinists believe? Most of these systems have softened their libertarian stance to consider mitigating factors like self-defense, provocation, or mental illness when passing sentences. Even the most advanced criminal justice system does not factor in these elements when adjudging a person innocent or guilty. In all modern courts, Jean Valjean would still have been found guilty of stealing the loaf. All that would change would be his sentence. Even then, the continued survival of mandatory minimum and death sentences proves that determinists only exist in philosophy books or jail cells. The black sheep has existed as long as there have been sheep. The only question is whether the black sheep was born black or became so along the way. Society does not take kindly to any members who reject the social construct. An unsaid part of this unwritten contract dictates that we have free will, but are expected to rein it in. Thank you for watching the video. Please like, share the video, and subscribe to get all the latest updates.